Welcome to the 44th Annual Old Dominion University Literary Festival. Our theme this year, Afterwards, highlights works that address the storms of past and present and the changes wrought upon us as we turn to face the future. I'm Kent Wascom, co-director of the festival along with my colleague Katherine Jackson, and we'd like to thank you all for being here tonight for a reading by author and journalist Meredith Toulousan, an event made possible thanks to the generous sponsorship of ODU's Gay Cultural Studies program. Following the reading, we will have time for audience members to ask questions. So if you're watching out there, please feel free to leave your questions for the Q&A portion in the comments. It is now my honor to welcome to the stage, as it were, to introduce Meredith, ODU creative writing student and president of the Filipino American Student Association, Gabriela Igloria.
Thank you so much, Kent. Anak araw is a Tagalog or Filipino word whose literal translation is child of the sun. It is also the term used in the Philippines for albinism, a layered mythologizing symptomatic of the reverence for whiteness that comes out of colonial experience. It also marks the acute sense of difference, setting the albino child apart from the so-called normal community through the double lenses of exceptionality and queerness. Meredith Toulousan recounts what her grandmother told her. As soon as she held me in her arms, she was sure I was a blessing. She refused to allow anyone to talk to me any other way, especially because I was destined to live in America. Meredith has been perceived, among other things, as cisgender, as native-born, as able-bodied, as white, all of which she is not. The engagement with the complications of whiteness and of gender, in all the multiple and unflinching ways Meredith experiences them, forms the subject of her critically acclaimed memoir, Fairest. Fairest takes readers through Meredith's early years as a child actor in the Philippines to when she moves from the village to Manila, then to college at Harvard. The memoir takes great care to make readers understand that it is not a narrative of chronological or psychological progression, perhaps especially because, as Meredith says, so much trans memoir has been about explaining ourselves to cisgender audiences and justifying our existence, and I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to give myself the opportunity to be able to understand and situate my experience during those periods of my life with the person I am now. So the reader is positioned not as a person that I am explaining myself to, but as an observer in my self-exploration. I'm honored and proud to welcome award-winning journalist and amazing writer Meredith Toulousan to ODU's 44th Literary Festival.
Thank you so much, Gabby. That was such a wonderful, sweet, incisive, generous introduction. And it's such an enormous pleasure to be with you in spirit, to be with you virtually tonight. I'm here in New York right now, traveling actually, and I'm just trying to imagine you all in the spaces that you're in Virginia, and I know that a number of you have read Fairest in class, and I'm deeply honored that you have. And I really wanted to talk today about some of the implicit and explicit influences to this memoir, just because I think it would be really helpful, especially for those of you who are working on your own creative nonfiction. And also, I feel like it's helpful for me, just in terms of thinking through, what it means now that now that the book has been out for a reasonably long time. And like one of the funny things about writing this memoir is that so many people were sort of surprised, or at least, or at least wasn't expecting me to write a memoir, because I had been known primarily as a journalist prior to me working on Fairest. But internally, actually, because I did my MFA in fiction, so much of my implicit influence is comes from fiction writers and comes from novels, because I have been reading novels and reading fiction pretty much ever since I started learning English, when I was a kid in the Philippines. And I think those formative experiences, kind of like bleed into your work in ways that can be sort of difficult to define until you are in a position to try, to sort of think about them and introspect about them. So that's what I really want to talk about today, and I think especially because of the fact that um, in intersectional writing from the perspective of a kind of like indefinite or multiple or hard to define identities or life experiences, there actually are not many models still for that kind of writing period. And certainly not many models for me while I was, while I was growing up as a writer. And certainly one of the earliest books that influenced me in that regard is Alexander Chee's Edinburgh, which is a novel that centers on a boy named Fee, who is in a boys' choir with another boy. The Fee is half Korean, and he is in choir with another boy, a blonde white boy named Peter, and and the two of them are. And the choir leader, Eric, is unfortunately sexually abusive towards children, right? And there's this moment in the book when um, Peter is chosen for a solo in choir, and Fee realizes that the reason why he's chosen for a solo is because of the fact that he's white and he would look better, like at the top of the choir. I wanted to read you this very short passage that just describes this really, really amazing contradiction, right? And he talks about a descant is the solo that was available to sing. The descant is a melody sung by a soloist in counterpoint to the melody sung by the sopranos, a single voice above all the others, stepping its way through by means of lyric and syncopation, one part song, one part refrain. The chorus sings at the same time as the descant singer. I want the descant. I know I'm good enough, my voice, my range. I learn faster, but I see immediately then what Big Eric wants. The blonde hair at the top of the riser. Imagine him singing. You would want to touch what you heard, hold it to your heart. And um, and Alex Shee's gift for maintaining those contradictions and sort of like setting them in counterpoint with each other was something that was deeply resonant to me as I was reading Edinburgh. And I wanted to read the section of Ferris that in retrospect I wasn't actually thinking of this at the time, is definitely like heavily influenced by that sort of sense of contradiction. It happens in the and I'm reading from my iPad because even though I have the book with me, because of my albinism, I have low vision and it's easier for me to read electronically. So this passage actually begins the last section of the book, but it describes a trip in which I return to the Philippines shortly before the millennium, and um, in 1999, right after college. I think that's pretty much all you need to know, and it describes my relationship with my grandmother. So I'm gonna start reading. I returned to the Philippines for the millennium, December 1999. My flight landed at the Ninoy Aquino International Airport near midnight, the coolest time of the coolest month. Even so, I bristled at the switch between the hermetic, air conditioned confines of the arrivals area and the humid, cloying outdoor space where hordes of people waited to meet arriving passengers. Apart from the mingled sweat, there was that vague yet persistent odor of Manila I never noticed until I returned after a decade, and have since recognized as the rot of open sewage and never collected trash. It was Nanay Cora's voice I picked out among the relatives who called my name, and my grandmother greeted me with a gush of tears, lamenting that I had not seen my grandfather before he died. As we hugged, I wish I'd kept in better touch, but I was too busy earning the life she wanted for me, too focused on notches of achievement instead of sentimental letters or expensive calls. We began the 2 hour drive home to Talaksan, me wide eyed with jet lag and nostalgia, while my relatives in the back of the van, various family members from 3 generations, died down and slept after a while, until it was only me and the silent driver who were awake. I kept going through the feeble exercise of matching reality with memory, patterns of light as we passed through the city on our way to the province, which, in my jet lag and poor vision, I didn't fully recognize as real until we got to the familiar open highway that led to Bulacan, which itself was just a long stretch of vague blankness, no lights to illuminate the endless succession of paddy fields and give them specificity. 10 years were enough to erase whatever intuition I had of my place in this world, until our vehicle turned right and into our municipality of San Rafael. With only the van's headlights to guide me, I recognized the old pattern of native wooden houses interspersed with cement constructions painted pastel, the municipal center, where the road splits in two, as I asked the driver to take the path next to the Angat River, which I could only glean as a dark absence while lights from houses dotted its banks. How strange it was to think of this as the boundary of my knowledge as a child, when I had nearly circumnavigated the world since, crossing the Pacific to get here and the Atlantic to get to England, a place I'd visited many times instead of returning home. Eventually, the roads met again, and we came to the uphill rise that brought back a feeling of hope, because it led to our house next to the town chapel and the memory of those years, really, until I moved in with Rafe, who was my pre transition partner, when this was the only place where I felt truly loved. The car drove past the assemblage of bamboo and thatch my family lived in until I was 12, and I suddenly felt the gulf between the child I was and the adult I had become. I excavated the precious memory of me lying on our bamboo slat floor on idle afternoons, peeking through the spaces between to spy the sacks of rice beneath, tracing lines with my finger, and finding the spots where the slats were nailed to their underlying wooden supports. There were notion These were motions I performed out of habit for years, ones that started before I even had any inkling of future wonders. A child star career, a life in America, Harvard, coming out, a relationship with a lovely man from a distinguished family. Yet that home had become distant too, even for my own relatives in the Philippines, abandoned in favor of a house that mimicked the West with its marble floors, its chintzy chandeliers, its beds. It was at this house that the van stopped, and where my grandmother led me to my old corner room overlooking the poultry farm, the mango orchard, and the rest of our land, invisible at night, as I settled for staring at the blank ceiling until sleep began to take over, only for my eyes to pop awake with the realization that in that memory of my early childhood, I'd forgotten that my skin was white. One of my aunts invited me to visit her at her new house in the Cainta district of Manila, 3 hours away at the eastern edge of the sprawling, badly planned metropolis. Nanay Cora and I made the trip together a few days after I arrived. The two of us had gotten more used to each other by then, though she had a lot more to adjust to, since she was the same doting woman who favored me over everyone else, just sadder because her beloved husband was dead. Whereas I must have been alien to my grandmother, as I paraded around in my linen pants and designer sunglasses, an impeccable New England by way of Hollywood accent to match. This was typical of immigrants returning home, showing off prosperous lives while hiding the effort and sacrifice, making ourselves appear more moneyed, more accomplished than we actually were. Except I actually was moneyed and accomplished, my bank account full of my partner's inherited wealth, my elite degree an unquestionable reality, though there were times when the memory of that experience didn't feel real even to me. Nanay Coro couldn't help but treat me like the child she remembered, maybe because she couldn't understand the person I had actually become. My grandmother humored childhood whims I no longer had, like my dislike of vegetables and soup. So all my meals were a spoiled Filipino brat's fantasy: fried chicken, fried pork, fried beef, cured or seasoned with salt and served alongside rice and ketchup. I indulged her by not mentioning that the adult me preferred more complicated dishes, but I was indulging myself too by recalling the simplicity of my life before I was wrested from my grandmother. That simplicity itself was a luxury I no longer had, as someone who had to flit back and forth between vastly different realities of being: a Filipino who was also American, brown inside but white outside, deeply in love with a man I hadn't managed to tell my Filipino family about. I had asked Rafe to stay behind at the last minute because it felt too overwhelming to come out to my family and bring a white man home at the same time. "How is life in America?" my grandmother asked as we sat in crawling Manila traffic, having left the house too late in the afternoon and found that the Christmas season extended our trip by several hours. The equatorial sun had shifted from day to night by then, so much sooner than in America. Among all my close relatives, Nanay Coro spoke the least English, so I had to recover my tongue as I tried to wander through a life I'd never thought of in Tagalog before. "There's snow in Boston, like shaved ice, except softer, and this makes it very cold. I live in a kind of house called a brownstone because the outside of it is made with stone that is brown. I make drawings on the computer at a school called MIT to show people how the human eye works." As I rendered these scenes for my grandmother in my first language, it occurred to me that I was also translating them for myself, integrating the person I had become with the person I had been before I left. The gulf not so vast that there was no way to travel between the two languages and cultures I knew best. "Is there someone you love?" she asked, though the verb form she used, minamahal, with a prefix mina instead of just the simple verb mahal, in a language where verbs not only coded for time but subtle shades of feeling, to me sounded more like, "Is there someone you are loving?" more active and ardent. "There is," I replied. "We live together." I muddled through a picture of my life with Rafe, his kindness and his strength, how he was a professor but also did most of the cooking because he enjoyed it. I knew that my string of sentences would end with me telling my grandmother that I lived with a man, but the convenience of genderless pronouns in Tagalog allowed me to defer that confession. "Actually, the two of you remind me of each other, both smart and nice," I said, and I could tell, even in the dark, that my grandmother was smiling. "Next time, you bring him," Nanay Cora said in careful English, and I was surprised to find myself unfazed by her knowledge and the deliberate switch to a language she barely spoke, just to tell me she knew without needing to discuss it at length. I realized then that I never really doubted her acceptance, but I was so afraid to tell her because it would mean that I could never again be perfect in her eyes, someone she and my family could unquestionably be proud of. getting to my aunt's house with the knowledge that this part of me was no longer a secret between us, I felt more complete than I had in a long time. Um, One of the things that I now identify in my writing this book is that flow of contradiction that's so present in Edinburgh, as well as a lot of Alex Shee's writing. If people have read How to Write an Autobiographical Novel, which has a lot of his personal writing, that is also that's a feature in many of his essays. And that space, I call it the space of contradiction, is something that I really love to explore, and is something that is really that is really right for writers like us who have intersectional and overlapping and confusing and and liminal identities. Another major influence in terms of my work is Susan Choi, and especially this novel, My Education, which which is a book that is really fascinating because it is the main character. Her name is Regina Gottlieb. She is a half Filipina, half Jewish English graduate student who ends up having an affair with the wife of one of her professors. And what's really fascinating about Regina is that her voice is so steeped in academia that I think it's very hard to code her imaginatively. Like one of the challenges of and a challenge still, in that we, I think, collectively, societally have to deal with, is that I think we still code certain kinds of rhetoric as white automatically, rather than rather than thinking of a type of language as academic. We still associate academic language with a particular type of person. And one of the really fascinating aspects of the book is the way that I think it just keeps slipping. Like my perception of Regina keeps slipping. And so she has these experiences like she has an encounter with the police that I think of as, oh, like grad student, like encountering the police. And then it's only later that I think to myself, oh, like she's a brown woman, like this would be, like her experience of this police encounter would be different. And I think those kinds of slippages of perception are definitely an aspect of Ferris that, that I was really deeply preoccupied by. So I'm going to read a section that illustrates this particular aspect of the book pretty well, I think. And it is so one of the for people who haven't read the book, one of the ways in which it's structured is it's structured mostly chronologically. It's in three sections. One is my childhood, the second is college, and the third is the period shortly before my gender transition. Um, and then, but within all of those sections are these self-contained flash forwards, which sort of explore the repercussions or the effects of decisions that I made, or have resonances with experiences that I'm having, like more recently since I transitioned. And this is one of those sections. Um, and okay, I'm just going to start. May 2014, a month after I published my first article about being trans, I woke up at dawn between two naked men on the top floor of a townhouse in Park Slope. I'd followed the rules of straight womanhood for over a decade, and it hadn't made me happy. So I wanted to test my boundaries, push myself to be with people in ways I hadn't before. That was when Barrett and Jason came along, a bisexual couple I met online who were interested in dating a woman. I turned on my side to face Barrett, the one with whom I felt a stronger romantic attachment. Bald and a decade older than me, Barrett had left his own rural upbringing in Alabama to become a modern dancer and interactive artist in New York, which led to a career as a digital consultant and allowed him to unexpectedly come into wealth. He and his partner Jason didn't know I was trans when we first met, but I sent them one of my articles, and, as I had hoped, they treated my gender as a non issue. Barrett opened his eyes and smiled. I could tell they were hazel, but not much else. Though I'd examined plenty of close up eye pictures before and filled in details with my mind: dark rings around his irises, dilated pupils because of the dim dawn light, and maybe a little bit his attraction to me. He tilted his head to indicate that we should leave the room together, and I followed him down a set of wooden stairs with steel pipes for rails, part of this couple's industrial aesthetic, in a house they designed and renovated themselves. "I'll get us some coffee," he whispered as he proceeded to the kitchen on the ground floor, while I stayed on the second, an open area lined with bookshelves, a peacock green velvet couch on one side, and a mid century dining table on the other. Off that big room was a smaller room they used for guests. I noticed that the door was open, so I went inside. Barrett and Jason also used the room as a walk in closet. I noticed a shelf of stylish shoes on one side and suits on wooden hangers. On another end of the room was a giant mirror, framed in ornate gold leaf, leaning against the wall. I stood in front of it and looked at myself as morning light illuminated my body, and recalled how comfortable I'd been walking around nude in Barrett's presence. It was a relief to feel safe without clothes in front of someone else, after years of asking men to turn lights off, for fear they would find something overly masculine about my body, my too slim hips, my muscular shoulders and back from years of lifting weights, a fear that did not go away even when men admired that body for being powerful and athletic. "Admiring yourself again?" Barrett asked as he poked his head into the room, then went in to stand behind me. "I'm sure it feels great to be almost 40 and have the breasts of a teenager." I laughed, not just at the joke, but at the openness of our relationship. The past decade, when I decided to be private about my transition, except to those I was closest to, the men I'd been involved with had accepted my history as fact, but had also been all too willing to deny its reality, something never to be discussed again once revealed. Though really, I was more responsible for this than they were, because their reticence was an echo of my own shame, my silence like trying to suffocate my history by refusing to breathe. It was such a relief to exhale. "It's funny," Barrett continued as he stared at my reflection. "I know you're trans, but I can't really tell. It's a lot harder to see you were an Asian man when I can't see you as Asian to begin with. To me, you're just a woman with a dancer's body." I nodded. I knew by woman he meant white woman. I wanted to be pleased, but was surprised at myself that I wasn't. We left the room and had coffee at the dining table, but Barrett's words kept playing in my head. "I don't see you as trans," coupled with, "I can't tell you're Asian." The way he looked at me was exactly what I'd honed over many years, this trick of perception, and it puzzled me that I was dissatisfied over having accomplished it, a state of being so many trans women sacrifice so much to achieve. Maybe I didn't feel the satisfaction because I hadn't sacrificed enough, only had reassignment surgery, hadn't touched my face or gotten implants. The remaining undisclosed for a decade was burden enough, so it wasn't that. It was something about how my gender and race reflected on each other like a dizzying hall of distorted mirrors. When people looked at me and only saw a white person, I understood that being white wasn't actually better, that I only coveted whiteness because of what I associated it with: wealth, education, and beauty. But for someone like me, whose whiteness was literally skin deep, who did not have any meaningful European ancestry, to be perceived as white could only mean that whiteness is nothing more than illusion. In an ideal world, I wouldn't need to go through so much effort, make so many sacrifices to gain the privileges of whiteness, and other brown people who are not albino would have just as much access to those privileges if they wanted it. I flinched when Barrett told me he only saw me as a woman because my experience with race forced me to understand that womanhood wasn't real either. I wanted to be a woman because I wanted other people to perceive my qualities through the lens of that gender. But having molded myself to their expectations, I now understood how much of an illusion gender was too. To become a woman in the world's eyes, I made what felt like a huge sacrifice at the time, reassignment surgery, but in hindsight was really a cosmetic change not unlike a nose job, a shift in a body part's aesthetic appearance while keeping its function intact. The only difference was the meaning our society invested in one body part versus the other. Had I lived in a world where men were allowed to dress and behave like women without being scorned or punished, I wouldn't have needed to be a woman at all. Um, so I really kind of, one of the things that I really want to explore in my work, in all of my work, is the multiplicity of identity and the multiplicity of perception, so that experiences can kind of like layer themselves onto each other, so that the first time you read about an experience, it illuminates your knowledge of the identity of a person changes based on like based on what you learn about them later. So, and that's super, super important for in my education. And the last influence that I want to discuss is Jamaica Kincaid's short yet stunning novel, Lucy, which is really, I remember it as the first book that I read in college where I just deeply, deeply identified with the narrator as an immigrant. Like Lucy is a woman who is a teenage woman. I think she's 19 at the beginning of the novel, who is hired from the West Indies to be an au pair for a wealthy New England family. And I'm not going to read the passage because we don't have a lot of time, but there's this wonderful passage where she talks about seeing the bright sun in January and dressing in warm clothes and then going out and realizing that it was really, really cold. And that was something that literally happened to me my freshman year of college when I moved from the West Coast and experienced East Coast winter, or winter at all, for the first time. And I wanted, to end my reading, and thank you again for inviting me. I wanted to read this passage from Ferris that talks about my first experience with snow, and so let me see. I just want to make sure that I have enough time to read it, so I'm going to skip over a couple of parts. Okay, so basically, I was working. This was Thanksgiving weekend, so nobody was at Harvard, but I couldn't afford to go back home. So I was there for Thanksgiving, and me being the nerd that I was, I ended up working on a paper on Angels in America in the computer lab. There were computer labs back then. We didn't have our own computers, and then. And yeah, and so this is where that starts. It was eerie to come out of the computer lab and find the facility half lit with absolutely no one outside, not a single student or even a guard, as if there had been some cataclysmic event while I was working on my paper, and I was now the only person in the world. I approached the building exit, a wall of glass with a revolving door in the middle, and sensed, even from afar, that there was something different about the landscape beyond. Brighter, until I remembered as I got closer that the snow must have now settled on the ground. Though I was unprepared in my fall jacket, it still felt warmer outside than I'd anticipated, maybe because of the excitement of seeing snow for the first time, which was still falling at a languid pace. I walked through the giant arched gate into the yard and traversed the long diagonal from one side of that field to the other. Widener Library in front of me, or Emerson Hall to my left, on my way to Wigglesworth, my dorm at the top left corner. I got to the end of the path but didn't feel like going inside, so I turned around. There was only a single set of tracks in the snow, and those tracks were mine. An image from the movie Dead Poets Society flashed through my head. Its protagonist, Neil, looks out his bedroom window in the middle of a snowstorm and sees only white, but could not see himself in that world because his father was forcing him to study medicine instead of following his own dreams of becoming an actor. But here I was, alone at the center of the most famous school in the world, and I was only responsible for myself, free to find my own way. I was poor but independent, with no obligation to my parents or even to my grandmother, the person I loved most in the world, because I already far exceeded her expectations. In that white, unpeopled landscape, I felt the overwhelming freedom of being able to study whatever I chose, become whoever I wanted. And it's been, I have to say that being a writer and choosing to be a writer is probably certainly one of the very top decisions that I have made for myself, and being in these occasions, being able to have the privilege of talking to other people about my work is something that I feel very, very fortunate to be doing, and I look forward to hopefully seeing work from from other people, other participants in this conference, and students at Old Dominion. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Meredith. That was
Thank you, Meredith.
absolutely wonderful. Thank you again for being here. Um, so hopefully we'll be getting some questions popping up in the little sidebar over there in the chat. But in the meantime, I just want to say how much I love the structure of your talk. Braiding the influences on the work with the work itself just seems so it's so refreshing in a field that's often built on the like singularity of the writer, right? Like it all came from me. There was nothing before. There's nothing that came otherwise. You got me reaching around my office trying to find all my chi, but I only have my Queen of Night, which I can't because I'm a historical fiction nerd. But
a book of his I also love, but I probably it's probably fair to say that Edinburgh is a more influential book for me.
Yeah, to be sure. Well, as we get those questions in, I guess I'll begin with one of my own. I won't lie, and my heart began to beat fast when you said that you were shifting to fiction.
It's true.
So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that shift and maybe what's driving that in your artistic process or your vision for your work in the future to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty fascinating just because like as people who've read the book know, the book ends, the main narrative for the book ends in 2002. And I actually, had already outlined a future memoir that would continue that narrative. But then after writing the memoir, one of the things that I found is that I found myself with just sort of like room to think about all of the, like now that my my the substantial part of my life story, which I had been trying to turn into fiction for a long time, is now in the form of a memoir. Like my mind suddenly felt free to engage with, um, with issues and themes that that I've been really preoccupied with, outside of the boundaries of my own experience. And so I ended up just sort of really naturally gravitating towards fiction. And also, I think, I do have one of those personalities where, I don't find things interesting to do unless I find them really, really scary and not sure if I can actually do them. And so I think there is like a part of it where I felt like, okay, like I know how to write a memoir, but I don't know how to write a novel. So so let's figure that out.
Have there been any, since you've spoken about influences, have there been any texts that have been helpful in that process, that have been helpful in crafting or generating a novel?
Yeah, I mean, what's really funny, I've led a number of different lives, right? Or I've been extensively involved in a number of different things. And when people have asked me, like what this novel is about, the thing that I've said is, and this is really the only thing that I could say right now about the novel, is that it's about primatology, dance, and war. And and the and what's really interesting about that, for me at least, is that I think so much of what people think of as minority fiction, or fiction written from a minority perspective, is often fiction that people identify as personal, or people identify as, coming from, this sort of like very kind of like personal experiential place, autobiographical, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm really invested and really interested in sort of, trying to sort of like disrupt that association, or that dichotomy, where it's sort of like, oh, like a scientific book, or a book that deals with sort of like large scale, um, issues about like the nature of our existence, like is a type of book that, that minority writers don't write, right? And so I'm simultaneously, like influenced by this type of work, right? By people like Alex Shee, and Susan Choi, and Raven Lailani, and Ocean Vuong, and these amazing intersectional minority writers, while also reading Ted Chiang, Cixin Liu, Richard Powers, and yeah, and just kind of like figuring out whether how those influences can kind of coalesce into a book that makes sense.
Oh, I eagerly await seeing the process, take full shape, and flower. And now I just want to ask you your favorite Ted Chiang story.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many, right?
Right? It's a tough one. Let's see. Y'all post those questions. We are eager to see them. Now they're popping up. I'm getting one, but it's cut off on my screen, unfortunately. How terrible. Regardless, I've heard a lot of folks who work primarily in nonfiction, but especially the personal essay, talk about it as a very, very distinct form from fiction, and not just because of the subject matter, but even in in the act of composition itself.
Mm.
as a different thing in terms of um, accessing parts of oneself, versus reaching to create others who might act as bridges between us and readers. Has the process do you see those processes as different, as entirely distinct things, whether
I
in composition or execution?
Right. I don't think of the memoir writing process for me as particularly distinct from fiction. I think particular kinds of personal essays, ones that, that for instance respond to a topical issue or are assigned by an editor in a media context, can feel different, because you have an assignment, like you have an argument that you want to tie to the personal experience. So in that sense, it engages with a different part of my brain. And I talk about this a lot, where I have typing work and I have handwritten work. So typing work is anything that involves analysis or argument, and handwritten work involves anything that doesn't have that constraint, right? And so certain personal essays feel like they need to be typed because it's about, it engages my academic brain where I have to prove a point, right? Whereas there are other ones where I just want to explore an experience, and that feels to me a lot more like fiction, and it feels like it, the only difference being that there is that parameter that it has to hew to my lived experience. And a lot of times, like your unique perspective really can shift that experience really markedly, so much that it doesn't necessarily have to feel so different from fiction, right?
Yeah. Oh, and I love the idea of different tools for different processes. That's absolutely fascinating to me. That kind of appeals to my my sense of things as well. Do you mind if I ask what you do? You have specific tools for when you're handwriting? Um,
Yes. I use this journal when I handwrite. It's a Rhodia Goal book, and
uh,
it's dotted if people, like if people want to see,
yes.
because I like the order of the lines, but I also don't like being distracted by lines. And then I use a fountain pen called a Pilot, which is not around me right now. It's called a Pilot Falcon. Um, and I just really love making something. Like it's like when I'm not happy with my writing. Like at least I've made something that's like sensually pleasant, and like something that I can appreciate as an object, so it doesn't make me feel as despondent.
No, it's wonderful. It makes me feel so much better because I love the object of it, right?
Yeah.
And Helen DeWitt talks about that too, in terms of like thinking about a writer's manuscripts and materials in the way that we would a visual artist's sketches and plans for a painting, or the tools that they use.
One of my Yeah, and she's absolutely one of my favorite writers. I remember, it's funny, like I was heavily influenced by sitting next to this French scholar named Hélène Sixeux for a seminar when I was in undergrad, and she said, when people asked her how she writes, she said, I have, in her French accent, of course, she was like, "Oh Jacques," I'm gonna try to imitate her. "Oh Jacques Derrida," right? And she's like, "Oh Jacques, he uses the ordinateur, but no, not for me. I have this giant box of different types of paper in different colors and sizes, and whenever I have some things that I want to write, look at the box and find the perfect piece of paper to write on. Yeah. So
Oh my goodness. Yes. Oh wow, what a cool thing to get to sit next to Lindsay Sue. Whoa. Liz holding that too, of course. I was forgetting. Um, oh, that's magnificent. Oh, and the question that I foolishly cut off is it last giving it space?
Mhm.
And that's coming from Emma, saying I recently heard someone make a comment that a writer only has one memoir in them. What would be your response to that idea?
I mean, that's a very unimaginative person who wrote that comment. I mean,
Yeah,
I I could spend my entire life writing memoirs. I mean, and the thing is that if you think about how, um, like if you think the experience is so infinite, right? And also like once one figures out as a writer the engine for one's writing so that it's not even the experience itself that the reader wants to get out of you but the way that you render the experience, then like you can just write about an hour, right? Like of your day, or you can write about like one sort of like really, one distinct aspect of, like of your life experience and render that in, like in just these really amazing ways, right? So I absolutely don't believe that a person only has one. I'm going to confess that I have outlined three myself, and hope to be able to get my memoir mojo back so that I can write them, because what's really funny about, like, as working on I mean, I don't know if you experience this, but for me, working on a book is not like the most important thing is not whether the book is going to be good or not. The most important thing is that you are actually interested enough in the book and interested enough in what you're writing about that you can invest the at least 2 years if you are Philip Roth, um, but more likely 3 to 5 or 7 or 10 or 12 or however many years
right.
working on that book, right? And so I'm in that stage in my memoir writing where like where I feel like, oh, these experiences would actually be really important, and like they're ones that I would love for people to read about, because like I feel like they're illuminating, but I'm just not in that psychological space where I feel ready to write about them. So
Certainly. No, I wholeheartedly agree about the process of writing. Like, you have to be the one that's interested, right? To move to the next sentence in the same way we want someone else to move to the next sentence. Um, I feel like a lot of the people who talk about I mean, there's a time, right, when in the composition, or all quite often in the editing and the proofreading or whatever of a book, where we might not be kindly regarding it, right? We might be scowling at it and like shoving it across the desk, but but it has to interest you. It has to captivate you and keep you wanting. And I think it's a wonderful thing for the writers out there to think about. Um, well, I think let's see if we have one more. Anyone else? Let me check our time. We are there. Unfortunately, Meredith, thank you so much for spending the time with us, sharing your work and the work of others that was formative. Again, I just think that's absolutely beautiful, and something I might steal. So please send me for the future. I would love to
feel
do
free.
it.
It is not a format that is proprietary. I am not that, the white woman who is angry at Sonia Larson. Sorry,
I was we. I had many
sorry
discourse
to
questions.
make that reference at the end, but but you gave me the opening, so
Oh, no, I'm so sorry. We did have one, and I would hate for a question from an ODU student to not go answered. If you don't mind,
Oh no,
sorry for that premature exit. But from Kia, do you believe that experiences made writing easier? Maybe your lived experience made writing easier, for the memoir in particular.
Do experiences make writing easier? I mean, to some extent, I suppose. I mean, to some extent, um, having distinct experiences gives you sort of like ready access, right, to to material that people might want to be interested in reading about. But the thing that I found working on Fairest is that, and I think the really important thing that any literary writer has to think about is just the fact that um, that usually like even if an experience is sort of like is glitzy or is something that feels ready to be written, that feels like
Right.
very sort of like ready to be written about. um, Ultimately, what makes the writing shine is your perspective on the experience and the way that you render the experience. And one of the things that I realized working on the book um, is that it's actually in that probing, it's actually in that investigation where the sort of magic of writing lies, so that it doesn't have the experience itself doesn't have to be spectacular,
Right.
for you to be able to find aspects of the experience that you can render in your own unique voice and in your own unique style. Right? Um,
What a beautiful answer, and the cultivation of that voice, and that is what we want of all aspiring writers, and of all of us writing out there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Meredith. Um, thank you, Gabrielle. Thank you to the Gay Cultural Studies program, and thank you all for being here. Um, the so sorry, it's a late night. Please join us tomorrow for readings by Kelly Jo Ford and a workshop at ODU Virginia Beach. For the full festival schedule, please see the ODU Literary Festival website. Thank you again, Meredith. Wonderful evening.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure. Have a good night, everybody. Have a good festival.